The drinking review!
Hello and welcome to Aldra's book review, or the drinking review or something, where every month we review a different book that we have read together and hope that you have read it along with us, otherwise you lose points. This month we have, or rather last month, we have read Pearl S. Buck's The Good Earth, which is weirdly actually the first in a trilogy, which I've never read the rest of, though I read this when I was 12. First of all, how did you find The Good Earth?
I want to read the other two, so that's a good sign.
Very good sign. Me too.
Yep.
And I never knew there were sequels. For those that are only just joining, The Good Earth is a very unique, I think. It's historical fiction, I suppose is the correct term.
Historical fiction is what it's classed as.
Is it? It's set around the Taiping Rebellion, right? Taiping? Yeah, the Taiping Rebellion.
Yeah. I got the time period wrong, didn't
Think
I?
like Heavenly Kingdom times, so like the first railroad is towards the middle section of the chronology, which is around 1880s, and it ends around 1911 or so. But it's a historical fiction novel about that concept, the idea of being a Chinese farmer, but also exploring Chinese life. And I think the cool thing about this is the fact that it actually introduced Chinese culture to the West, and is one of the reasons why the Americans supported China during the Sino-Japanese War and sent a general to help support them. It's one of the reasons. There are many others. But they did actually reference this as a thing that encouraged towards positive Chinese culture.
Well, so they were supporting the culture in this book?
Yes. For Americans, if Americans had never really considered Chinese people except as invaders. America had passed a lot of legislation against Chinese immigrants. People were very racist towards Chinese people.
Right.
And after the publication of this book, people became a lot more sympathetic towards Chinese people after having had an ability to experience China. Olivia's face is like this because she found the book
terrifying. I think it's really, the way they treat females.
As a woman, I think it's an interesting text. If you're of the female persuasion, I'd recommend reading this book just to get an example of how Chinese women had it.
It was horrible. Like, the book's not horrible. The book's good. I liked the book.
Wonderful book.
But the culture was horrible.
Perplexing.
And it was horrible
upsetting.
to read at times.
Yeah, really terrible. I mean, the binding of the feet.
Oh, that bit was really horrible.
The focus on beauty, on frailty and usefulness.
Well, even just the bit where it's like his wife has to walk behind him.
Yeah, 2 feet back. That was a normal thing in Western cultures as well. And it's still a thing in Indian cultures, in many traditional Indian cultures.
It's really insulting.
It's much more an
Asiatic
Asiatic thing.
That and be like, this is okay, I'm supposed to sympathise with this character.
Yeah. I think the thing is about the idea of it being like making people more sympathetic with Chinese people. It's not that we like Chinese culture and want to emulate it. It's more that it brought the idea of being Chinese towards like, oh, these are people.
Yes, it did make them feel like people, and you went through their different struggles.
Prior to this in America, Chinese people were very heavily discriminated against.
Okay.
They were like worse than Irish.
Right.
In America.
I can't see how this book does any good at, like, it's good at making them feel like people, and it's good at making you feel sympathetic towards like the famine and the different things they go through. But I wouldn't say it does anything to making them feel relatable to Westerners.
It's tricky because I think the thing, if we're gonna, I mean, this is interesting. We're talking about this in a historical context. Oh, by the way, and for this video, we're drinking Côte de Rhône. We've joined the Wine Society, and we're now getting wine shipments, and we're trying out some of their wines.
That sounds so pompous.
It sounds wonderfully pompous. I love it. So it's interesting when we're talking about this from the context of an historical effect. When you talk about a historical novel, I can tell this is going to be a long one. Warning. I think it's interesting when you talk about a historical novel that, generally speaking, when you talk about history, you're talking about two things. You're talking about the history of that's being talked about, but also you're talking about the effect it had on history.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that, for me, I'm quite familiar with the effect this had on history, in that it made people more aware and sympathetic to Chinese people and culture. Okay. Even just so far as the fact that people could be like, "Oh, you're Chinese, lot in the good earth, innit?" In an American accent. Prior to this, Chinese people were very heavily discriminated against. They were among the first cultures who had serious immigration controls put on them in America.
Yes.
And Chinese people were seen as not people, worse than blacks in some places. Consider, and if you know anything about American history, you know that's a bad position to be in.
Yeah, no, I know all of that with regards to the immigration to the West Coast and the difference in treatment there compared to Ellis Island and all of that. I get what you're saying, and I get that this does make them seem a lot more like people.
Definitely.
I just struggle to understand how this book makes Americans feel like they are the same or equal to Chinese. Because this book it's good. I like it.
Wonderful
and I
text.
think
I love it.
like from a historical point of view it was good, and from a story point of view it was good, and I was invested in the characters. But it is incredibly sexist.
I think an important thing to note, Olivia.
And it's the culture at the time. No, I'm not. This is nothing about the author.
Olivia's thinking I'm going to say, it's the culture of the time, you can't judge it.
I'm not judging
I think you
it,
should
I'm
look
just...
at the culture of America at the time this was published. This was published in the 30s. How dissimilar is the treatment of women in America in the early 1930s?
Oh, they were not binding women's feet to the point where they basically couldn't walk and they were in agony.
That would be considered a kind of cultural other, wouldn't it? The broad, rough treatment of women as less is not unheard of in America at that time period. It's not great.
I do get that, but I think this book is very extreme. Also,
women's suffrage was only 15 years before this book in England. Yeah. When was this book published? 35, 36?
So when it was first...
31. 10 years after suffrage. After women receiving the right to vote. And 8 years after American suffrage.
I do get that, but a lot of what I feel like I read in this book...
Yeah,
I don't want to go so far to say, it's never happened in this country. But it hasn't. It's not like in the last 100 years in this country.
Not even. Well, I mean, there's a quite unique thing in British culture in that we actually have a bit of a history of warrior women in Celtic Britain, and so it's different. But again, let's not do too much because we're focusing it from a Western modern perspective.
The women were referred to basically as slaves. Whereas,
is it a boy? No, it is just a slave. A character says at one point about a girl's birth.
That's not a thing in Western culture. So I like. It was a good book. It was educational in that sense. I struggle to see how that would make Chinese people in that time period feel relatable to
Well, this is
Americans.
an interesting theme for the review. The cool thing about these reviews, by the way, is that we set the book based on a desire of things we want to read or want the other person to read. But the thing is that we go into this with literally no planning. We spend more time deciding the drink we're going to drink than we do about what the theme of the video is going to be. And I think if we're going to talk about the theme in terms of, I don't want to say historicism, but like
its effect,
morality and effect, I think it's interesting to note that from a modern perspective, a lot of what happens is terrible. Like, it's awful. Yeah. The treatment of women is really awful. I mean, he treats his wife awfully. Women are just very mistreated. But the thing is that you can't lambast a text for that reason.
I'm not. No. I think it was a very good text. I'm just saying if you're looking at it from the point of view
but to whitewash it would be evil.
The effect that it had on Western culture, and you're saying that this was a really good book for Chinese
just America,
people
not really Britain.
In terms of the way they reviewed in America.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that it definitely does make them feel more human. It definitely does show, hey, look, they're people with struggles and
it's just that, really, It was really just that.
I can't see how this would make them feel like they are the same.
No.
They're still. It makes them feel like they are very much of another culture and of different traditions and different ways.
Very much so, but I mean, I don't want to get too much into it, but I think that there is a very interesting argument to be made that American politics with regards to East Asia is about sides. And it's important to note, in the same way as the later period of the Cold War, wherein nations pick a side based on their socioeconomic model of choice, capitalism versus communism. In the 30s and 20s, the side that a superpower chooses is the one that is most effective to their ends. And there was that question of Japan or China in the late 20s. And when this book was published, I don't have a specific quote, but in policy decisions and in some newspaper discussions, like, letters to the editor, but like editor's notes, we're giving opinion on policy, they reference this novel saying that American ideology is closer to a Chinese culture than a Japanese culture.
I do get that.
So from that perspective,
if you think about how the story progresses, it is very much this self-made man. It's here he is. He's just a typical farm boy. He could have just stayed exactly where he was.
Oh, that's a really good point. That American individualism is there. Yeah.
He basically rose to the highest position that he could be in the area that he lived in. Really,
he was the magistrate, wasn't he, at one point?
Yes.
Yeah. But he didn't do shit about it.
He really fell into that kind of capitalism kind of concepts, didn't he? He became quite greedy. He left behind the land that he
took a woman. a second wife.
Yeah, and then also when you start to look at then his sons, you've got the one that's very money driven and and then the one that's a lot more sensible.
The one he sends to the law, the one he sends to the trades, and the one he keeps for the farm.
Yeah, so if you want to look at that in comparison to that concept of like, oh, America is the country where you can come in with nothing and build yourself, especially in that time period. I mean, that was very much a concept.
Well, that's interesting.
Then yes, they do share a lot of similarities culturally.
But culturally and like intrinsic nature, like the religion, the treatment of women, even just the foods, it's unique. I think that's what I like the most about this text, is it's so unique in the way it portrays everyday realities for what at the onset of the book is an uneducated Chinese peasant, though he is not actually a peasant because China did not have a peasant class at this time. They had freehold farmers.
Right.
There is an economic difference. He's not really a serf, like he doesn't rent the land.
No, they own the land.
Yeah, they are actually surprisingly capitalist, at least in the east part of China.
Yeah.
But it gets a little bit more socialistic in the West, hence why communist China is in the mountain province in global war in the West. It's also the seat of power of it. But it's just interesting how you get the everyday elements of that, the rice, the different foods, the lard cakes with sugar, with red dye, which denotes luck. It's just, I found, reading it as a kid, obviously when I read something as a young person and then you take it and you read it in the old person, it still holds up. You're always looking at it from a nostalgic point of view. But for me, I really enjoyed it because it was my first experience with an Asiatic culture. I'd never, other than anime, I'd never actually seen like the perspective of a normal person, obviously completely removed from my time zone. I mean, he died in the 1920s at the latest, and like, what is that, a century difference between his death and my birth? But there's still this fundamental link between personhood, and it's interesting for me to feel like what it would be like to be a Chinese peasant. And I think that's what I like the most, that feeling of connection with a person, even though they didn't exist, in a time period and a culture that I don't understand.
I get what you mean. You follow him through his life, basically. Yeah,
it's a story. I mean, is it a Bildungsroman, technically?
You don't see him as a child, do you?
No,
he gets married,
he's 15 or 16.
Yeah, but kind of. He is
kind of Bildungsroman, yeah.
Yeah, no, that was nice to follow someone through their life, and then you can very much see how the next two books follow on with the fact that you've got to know the sons. I didn't even know
they were there.
I do really want to read them.
I think we should.
They're just hard to get a good edition of. So
yeah, we haven't got them because we really want like pretty editions. We're all about pretty editions. I mean, look at this cover of George MacDonald Fraser's Flashman. Look at that! Oh, it's so pretty. That's separate. It's just what I'm reading now. We read a lot.
No. What are you talking about?
No, I don't know what you're talking about.
No.
A book review channel. I want to talk one thing about you. For you. For me?
For you?
To me, to you. We never watched that.
No.
Non-British viewers, no idea
what
we're talking about. I want to talk to you about the concepts of the title raises, which is the good earth. Because we're talking about it mainly from a cultural perspective, the idea of Chinese identity. But what about the earth? What about the soil? And that might sound strange, but for me, my biggest takeaway from this novel was land. And not just land in the American West identity sense, like you get in Of Mice and Men, get a little ranch and live off the fat of the land, but in the sense that the earth provides, and you put your blood, sweat and tears into the earth, and you can raise a livelihood, and not just livelihood, but a success and a family and life from your hard labor in a kind of I guess the word might be bucolic lifestyle, this kind of picturesque farmy, but that's quite Western European.
I get what you mean. I think that kind of falls apart a bit though. Because
it does. It very much. It's very anti it at the end.
Yeah, we kind of established as well that the farm was kind of just ticking along. It wasn't really doing that well.
It was sustenance farming, yeah.
Yeah, and then it was only when the wife came along, really, and he suddenly had this extra pair of hands.
And she was working more than she should.
Yeah, that it kind of took off, and it became, rather than it becoming a family farm, it kind of felt like it became a bit of a business, especially when they move away from it.
Yeah.
And then he does go back before he dies, doesn't he? So there is still this connection to it. There's this kind of like, I want to go back to my true home before I die, which was quite nice. But I don't know, to me it more just kind of reeked of greed and kind of this really strong kind of capitalist kind of idea of, well, I don't need that anymore. There's men working that now and giving me the money, and I've moved on.
Agreed.
And I'm better than that land now.
I think my ideology stops about 45% of the way through the book.
I think it's more the wife than him that has this connection to the land and wants to put the time and the effort into it.
He has a symbolic connection to the land. He actually doesn't care about the land. He cares about status.
Yes, well, everything is greed. Status with him, isn't it?
And that's
even the cakes
the culture.
At one point. It's like
even the cakes.
Are made, but we're not for us to eat. They're for other people to see because they're a status symbol.
And you ask how this could link to American ideology.
Yeah, fine, fair enough.
For me, I consider myself a bit of a ideal homesteader person. The idea. I like the idea of growing things. And we're beekeepers. We're home brewers. I love the idea of going all in on that. Maybe not 100%, but at least growing more things. She wants a goat.
Goats are cool.
She wants 2 goats.
A goat get lonely.
Yeah, exactly. Goat get lonely. That's a great reply. And I want chickens, that kind of thing. And I think all of that idea, for me, comes from this book. I think before that, I'd never considered it. And after that, the seed was put inside. And for me, that concept comes from this text.
That's interesting because I feel that they just use the land as a means to an end.
Indeed,
they don't.
But there's this overall symbolic value, and then you get the impression at the end that there's the end bit. I think kind of ties it all together.
Going back to the land.
He goes back to the land, and he's dying. Yeah. Spoiler alert: a man dies in a historical novel set a century and a half ago. That he's there waiting to die, but in a nice way, like a retirement.
He's old. He's
done. So he's not. He's only like 83. This is healthcare. Yeah. So fair enough.
In the 1920s.
He dies in like 29 or 30 or 31. Right. So kind of depressing because that land is going to very quickly become a war-torn hellhole. Hebei province has suffered massively. So all that land's going to be destroyed by the Japanese. Oh, that's sad. Well, Carlos Buck wasn't to know.
Read the second and the third book.
Yeah. Well, even the third book wasn't written until... No, I think the third book was written at the beginning of the Sino-Japanese War, so she would have at least had some context for it.
Right, so the second and third book cover a shorter time period, surely?
I would assume so, because
otherwise they're writing in the future.
Yeah, that would be like, it's 2021, and 2 people are reviewing the books. But there's an idea at the end when he's at the farm, and you feel like you get that kind of end-of-life epiphany where he's desperate to have a connection to the land and be with the land, and the sons are talking about selling the land for their own personal gain because of greed and capitalist joy. But he is like, no, it's the land, you must hold on to the land. And there's that same thing that I think is that core concept to his soul, though I think greed is more powerful. It's the idea that land is land and it's what needs to be protected, and I think he strays from it and at the end realizes its value
and goes back to it,
but not even just goes back to it, but tries to protect it by tending to his children, which ties to something I wanted to mention about the rule of 3. Almost every culture has some concept about rule of 3. It's just the way human brains work, I think. But in Chinese culture there is an idea about the rule of 3. It's to do with family wealth, and it's like a societal irony that the first generation raises the wealth. They have some epiphany or invention, or through their own hard work, they raise up their value as a family and become prosperous. The second generation are raised at the beginning in squalor, in the same poor conditions as their parents, but at the middle and end get all that wealth and education and upbringing, and they are the nouveau rich, and as it would be referred to in America, this kind of newly wealth. And so they are wealthy, but they also scorn the poor because they know that they grew up that way.
Yeah.
And then so they still conserve some of it, but they scorn the poor. And then the third generation are raised wealthy and raised to scorn the poor and waste all the money.
So that's going to be his grandchildren.
And that would be his grandchildren, yeah. This book is the first generation, and we see the second generation in its onset.
The next one, we should see the second generation mainly, and maybe the start of the third.
That's what I think.
Well, some of the third generation exist at the end of this
book. They do, yeah.
They're not
so
real characters.
That's what I think is going to happen.
Yeah.
And that it's a Chinese concept that you raise the money, your second generation holds the money, but is a bit of a douche about it, and the third generation loses the money. And also, we see that, don't we, in the House of Huang, where he gets the wife from. Their families, they're like the grandchildren.
Yeah, well, that's where he ends up, isn't it?
Yes, that's where he lives. I mean, the ultimate irony, he takes over the house and fortunes and land of the previous great house who've fallen because of opium and extravagance.
Yeah.
So that's their fate. So what do you think about that as a concept?
That's cool. I want to read the second and third one, so it'd be interesting to see if that plays out.
I assume it will.
And how that,
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a cool concept.
It's depressing, though.
It is a bit.
We don't really get that in the Western culture, I think. That idea of the rule of three.
Maybe because it's a bit harder to destroy that quantity of money in modern Western culture.
Not even modern, I'm talking more like traditional culture centuries back. I think because in the UK
Still
we get...
harder to destroy that money because it's set up in a different
way.
It's not set up so much on farms and food.
That's true, industrial. Or business factories, or trade. Yeah.
I don't know.
Ooh, that's a really cool master's thesis, right? In the UK, in the UK we have a really strong tradition of hereditary families, of estates and lords and such what. Whereas in China there isn't that much of it's just a bunch of warring states all the time. So maybe in China, where they build up their wealth, they lose it due to war or famine, or they burn it through extravagance. But in the UK, we make money, and then that money gets reinvested into foreign enterprise like trade, which just keeps you being money, and then you end up in the House of Lords and you're richer forever.
Yeah, it's harder to
it's hard to lose everything.
That money in this country.
Yeah, that's interesting.
There you go.
There's a cool cultural divide.
Yeah.
Money! Wish I had some. Tell me some thoughts, just in general. Any particular points you want to raise about the book?
I did read this a month ago now, so it's
same.
I don't know. My main takeaways from this were the treatment of mainly the wife, but the females in general. It was just kind of horrible to read, but in an interesting kind of way. It was I don't know anything about this culture in this time period, so it's just very educational. I don't know. There were certain bits that I wasn't quite so invested in. I don't think I really cared too much about the sons. Once they got older,
they were just a bit annoying.
It just kind of felt like older siblings kind of squabbling with each other.
Indeed.
And
they didn't feel distinct.
They didn't, even though their personalities are supposed to be completely different.
Yeah.
I would have liked a bit more development as well with just all of the children. We never really... The daughters, for example, it's quite...
slaves.
Yeah, it's quite weak. We've got the one who clearly was ill during the famine, and as a result of that has some kind of mental disability.
Yeah.
And she's there. They acknowledge that she's there, but seemingly she just kind of sits all day and rocks backwards and forwards and doesn't talk or doesn't really know. I want to
raise though. Yeah. That is standard, not just for that culture, but this culture. Mental retardation.
Oh yeah, at a different time period.
That is what families would do. They would just be known as the family that had a squiffy kid. And that's what would happen, because there wasn't euthanasia, especially in cultures where that's extremely... in some cultures, they just, they yeeted off a cliff.
Yeah, but they just sit there. Yeah,
that is what British people did.
Also, the other daughter, I get that the whole point...
I don't even remember her.
The twin, they were twins.
Oh yeah, the one who got married and you never saw her again.
You never saw her again. Oh, no,
that is what happens.
No, I do get that. I understand, but I don't know. I felt like...
Sucks.
Time passed very quickly in this book, and as a result of time passing very quickly, we lost a lot of details, and it was a weirdly paced book in that you would get 3 chapters that seemed to take place in a week or a day over a particular point, but then suddenly another chapter would flash through 5 years, and so as a result of that, the main character, his dad and the first wife felt like fleshed out characters, but all of the children just didn't really feel like characters, and then even really the second wife, we never really got to know her, we never really developed her. I couldn't even remember her name.
I think it's really interesting having such a strong reaction to this.
Yeah.
Because I think of that as a trait of the book. And I think the reason for that is twofold. One, to represent the speeding of time as you age. Which is, we're young. So young. Grey hair in my moustache. We're very young.
Shouldn't have pointed that out.
Sorry, I don't mind. I've got a few. It's a consistent thing that in life, apparently, as you get older, time passes faster. I think that's actually really more to do with as you get older, your life becomes a little bit more boring and consistent, and thus large stretches of time can flow faster for you, relativistically. So keeping variety helps slow it down. But another trait is the fact that he's selfish. This novel is from Wang Lung, even though it's a third person. It's tainted by his perception, and I think that there is a selfishness to Wang Lung, the protagonist. I think there is a real selfishness and greed that makes him really lack empathy. And I think that's why you struggle to really understand other characters. You understand his father because he raised Wang Lung, and he's basically just a traditional old man. And you understand the first wife because of the sheer novelty of the experience of being with her. And other people fall by the wayside because Wang Lung just cares about Wang Lung. Main character's a bit of a douche.
I agree with you. I think I enjoyed it. I did like it. I'd read it again. I just think that the pacing could have been a bit
I agree with you.
better.
It was strange.
But then I get what you're saying of if you went for the idea that this was an old man in a sense, telling his life, even though it's not.
Like that. It's just it's a tainted perspective.
But it's it's the things that you remember. You don't remember every detail. You don't necessarily remember things paced and well. You just remember these events, and that's definitely what you get, which is fine. I would have preferred 300 extra pages and a lot more detail and a lot more character. And just there were certain events, I can't really remember which ones, but there were times with certain events where I'm and more. Come on, I want to know a bit more detail about that. I want to know how that pans out.
I think both of us
but
are
then
like
just
that.
move on.
We're just no. This. Talk more about this.
Yeah, it really did feel like that on a lot of occasions where I felt
they're part of they're part of the Taipei Rebellion, and their country is ruined by famine, and they're forced to flee into a town. And the only reason they make money, they get their fortune back, is because the city is sacked by the Taipei Rebellion forces, and then they get their wealth, and it's no. More about this.
But I guess it's because he doesn't know
exactly,
what that is and what's going on.
At one point there's a war going on. He's like, war? Oh, yes, that's always happening in the distance. No, it's here. Yeah. It's now.
He just goes over his head.
The description of a sword, his description of sharp, long knives that they have. It doesn't. So removed. But China's a very big country as well.
Yeah.
You can feasibly never see soldiers. Right? You can't live in the UK and never see a soldier, at least in most time periods,
Yeah.
Or war. There's war in Britain, it's going to be at your doorstep.
Okay. I get what you mean.
Yeah.
Whereas this is a much bigger landmass, it's easier to just disappear into a tiny little village and live out your life.
And just farm and eat rice and die age 75.
Yeah, the world outside his village doesn't really affect him until there's a need to leave that village temporarily.
The train, the fire wagons.
Fire wagons, yeah.
I said this to Olivia, but when I first read The Good Earth, they at one point they have to leave because they're starving, and they move to another city, which is I think Shanghai, I think, and they get a fire wagon in which they queue up for it and then sit down, and it spews fire forth and propels it forward. I did not understand that meant a train.
See, I got it, but
she got it instantly.
I was reading it. Over a decade after you?
Yeah, but I read it, I was like, oh my god, this is a train! I don't know what I thought this must have been when I was read it the first time. I was like, oh yeah, it's a fire wagon. Yeah, whatever. A dragon, it just takes you to the city. What's wrong with me? But that's also convenient in that it provides an historical time frame for the novel, because there's no years that are objectively set. You can tell something is the Taipei Rebellion because of the years and the attitudes, and there's the pamphlets about Christianity with the man on the cross. You know what kind of things are happening, and the fact that the trains are new means it's around the first time of introduction of railway. So it's 1870s.
Well, see, I struggled to place it because I
know
don't
more
have
about
that
this time period.
History in that context.
Yeah.
So you had to tell me,
did.
No, you're not in this time period.
Yeah, she thought it was the 1930s.
When he was talking about war. No, it wasn't the trains. He was
the first war.
And I was like,
you thought it was the Sino-Japanese War.
Going into,
Yeah, but I'm like, no, that's 50 years away or something. Yeah. Oh no, 60 years.
So a bit difficult, I guess, to get all of it if you're reading it without any context.
But you don't need it.
No, you don't need it.
Which is cool.
But I like to kind of piece things out on a timeline in my head, and
I
so
do
not
too.
having those dates.
That's why I like Flashman with the clear dates.
Yeah, so yeah, I'd like that. I would have liked, even if just like at the beginning of the first chapter it had put like a year, and then I from there could have.
Well, I know that First Buck specifically didn't do that because she wanted to ensure that her characters could take place in a kind of any time within this period. I mean, like, you know, one could argue the trains might not be the first introduction of trains. Maybe this town just got trains super late and it's 1901. Maybe the war isn't the Taipei Rebellion, but is instead the warlords era of 1911. It's possible. It's not likely, but it's possible.
It just doesn't... Sorry,
a different massive civil war in China. Different one.
This book just didn't conform to, I think, the kind of strict format of kind of what I like. When there's dates, I like the date to be written. When there's
we love info.
A big event happening, I like to know that it's that particular event. But I get that this character didn't know those things and dates weren't important to this character. But then I feel like maybe I would have preferred it from a first person rather than a third person. It feels like a first person towards the end. It does, yeah. But I still really enjoyed it. It still was good. I still do want to read the other two. Yeah. Despite these little things that I think would have just made it better to read.
I think it's one of my favourite books. I love it. But big part of that for me is nostalgia, I'm sure.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's one of the best books I've read. I would read it again, but I don't know. There were bits that I found weren't as interesting as others. My interest in it wasn't consistent all the way through. I think maybe because I was annoyed by it, did want more about the females and wanted more detail about what was going on with them.
Important to note, this book was written 90 years ago this year. 90 years. That's weird.
That is pretty weird. It didn't feel like it was written that long ago.
Yes.
It felt kind of modern. If you told me this book was written last year, but about...
I'd have believed it.
100 years ago, then I'd have been like, oh yeah, that's believable. The language was very modern.
Actually, that's kind of weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's interesting. We should read some more Paula's Buck's books. Yeah, she's written like a bunch of novels.
She has. She's written a lot of things.
I've never read anything else she's written, so...
Yeah. Well, I want to read the second one.
Yep.
And then probably the third one.
And then...
So that bodes well for
everything else. Yeah. So that's a good credit alone. Olivia says to read all of them. And I say so too, even though I haven't read them.
Yeah, I still want to know the fact that there is information about what happens to the sons, even though I didn't particularly like them. Is that why I do want to know what happens to them? The information's there, and the author has made me interested, and I was in the world. I felt invested in the world, even though I would have had more information about the world.
In other words, I want more. More.
Yeah, I think as long as it's a good book, I do much prefer the 700-800 page book where you're really in there and you know everything, rather than just kind of floating on the surface of things.
More detail, more dates. Today, on January the 11th, 1894, this happened. I just want diary entries.
Yeah.
I loved it. You should read it.
Yeah, I liked it. Definitely
Good
worth reading.
The Good Earth is good.
The Good Earth is good.
And that is the title. This is a monthly book series where we call it a bookathon. I don't know, a bookology. I don't know what the word is, but I'm going to look away. But
it's behind my back.
Okay, cool.
You can...
But the idea behind it is that every month we set a book that we are both going to read independently and then come back, like we're doing now, to review it. And hopefully... you read them as well. So when you watch this video, when Olivia reveals, because it's Olivia's turn, the book we're reading this month, I would like for you to read it over the next month, and definitely post in the comments of the video of next month's video what you thought about it. But let's see what this month's book is. And next month's video is going to be...
Okay, so I've picked a book that I've had for quite a while. I've heard very good things about.
I'll try and guess.
Okay, let's see if you can guess.
Okay.
So I had this book.
Okay.
Started to read it.
Yep.
Didn't get on with it despite it having good reviews. Okay. Got kind of annoyed with it. Gave it away because I also didn't like the edition that I had it in. Then rebought it like a year later in a completely different edition to match other books that I have.
Okay, yeah.
Still haven't read it.
Okay.
So I'm picking it as now I have to read it because I want to read it.
Okay. Give me a century.
It is Victorian.
Is it Dickens?
No.
No, I'm done. Give it to me.
Tenant of Watford Hall.
Oh, I knew it! I was in my head, but I was like, nah, it's not that. I've never read Tenant of Watford Hall.
No, neither of us have ever. I've read the first couple of chapters.
Oh, it's a Bronte!
It's meant to be really good, and I've never heard anyone really say anything bad about it. And so I don't know why I stopped after the first couple of chapters and just couldn't get into it. Maybe it was the slow pace of it.
Oh, it's a chunker. Chapter 52.
It's meant to be really interesting for that time period, for actually carrying on the theme, talking about women and talking about what is expected of them and the way they should behave. And then you have this, apparently, like this is all based off reviews that I've had, you have this scandalous woman, and it's about learning about her, why people are reacting badly to her, and how she's breaking the norm of what is expected. And yeah, meant to be good.
Alright. And by the way, I'm doing this because it smells really good because it's unread. So it's that kind of book bind glue smell, which just smells wonderful.
Yeah, I've never read this edition.
Stick your nose in there. Oh yeah.
Ooh.
Alright, so you're going to need to find a copy of The Tenet of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, the lesser known of the Bronte sisters. And join us for next month's book review. Let us know what you thought in the comments about The Good Earth, if you read it, or if not, what you thought about this. I dropped the book. Strange format for book reviews. We're going to then immediately go and review another book. And
what is it?
Bet you that the book we're about to review now is going to come out, the video for it is going to come out before the video we've just recorded now, because of the strict monthly schedule we've put in. C'est la vie. Thank you very much for watching. This is Aldra's life. I guess we're Aldra.
Read this.
Read that. Bye.